Steady yourself up.
Well, hello again. It's me, Colin Rowe, talking about all kinds of stuff that some might find confusing. All I can say is these are entirely my own thoughts, and you're perfectly entitled to fire any criticisms my way, any comments about erroneous things I might say. My only plea is that this is mostly off the top of my head. So if the thoughts come out sounding a bit wrong, then I plead guilty. Anyway, we've talked about keeping rules and what I see as the development of religious and spiritual movement through keeping rules to having the right heart, the right spirit, the right motive, which means that you keep all the rules. The saying that Jesus reiterated, a saying that came from the Old Testament, which he reiterates in the Gospels: you shall love God with all your heart and your neighbour as yourself. That's it in a nutshell. And we've thought of various other things that kind of give a little bit of perspective on that. I've got a confession to make. I really only have just about one message, and that is about the importance of living life according to the law of love. That's the long and the short of it for me. It may seem simple, but it's actually quite a challenge to live to that law. Well, it's not my own law, it's a universal law which I think is embedded deeply in the Christian faith and many other faiths as well. Anyway, I want to read you something. This is a bit of a show and tell session. It's about the Bible itself. Okay, so we're going to hit a few buttons here, and I suspect that some people will wonder what on earth I'm talking about. As I say, these are entirely my own thoughts. After many years of trying to live the faith and reading a lot and discussing a lot and studying, it's not everybody's conclusion by any means. Let me read you this. I came across it on Facebook the other day. I thought it was quite interesting. Two people read the same Bible. One sees reasons to love, the other reasons to hate. One sees unity, the other division. One finds prejudice, the other equality. One discovers compassion, the other indifference. One goodwill, the other malice. Two people, one book. One book, two views. The book is a mirror. The reflection is you. So there's a thought to run away with for a start. How do we approach the Bible? It's a big question these days because there appear to be quite a few challenges to viewing the Bible in the way that perhaps people have presented it to you in the past, it being the inerrant and inspired Word of God. Inerrant means that there is no error, there is no fault, there's no contradiction at all to be found between the covers of the Bible. It's quite a difficult stance to maintain these days unless you close your eyes to a lot of things that kind of jump out at you from the page, really. There are huge numbers of serious criticisms about the veracity of the Bible, the accuracy, and certainly to uphold that view of the scripture being God-breathed and perfect in every way is very, very hard to maintain if you spend more than 5 minutes thinking about it. Now, I think that there are approaches to the Bible which are useful. even in this day and age. No, we've got to recognize our own 20th century limitations. Sorry, 21st century limitations. Yes, I'm going to catch up with the 21st century soon. I feel it in my bones. And one is that the ancient mind, the kind of mind that wrote these documents that were compiled into the Bible that we have now, it's not like our modern mind at all. How could it be? The structure of society in that particular part of the Middle East is nothing like the structure of society that we have here in my particular country, in the UK, and in many other countries around the world. We have very little insight into the way that society was structured. We don't, by and large, we do not speak Aramaic or Hebrew, the languages that were largely used in the Old Testament to write these various books. And also we probably don't understand fully the reasons why those books were written in the first place, and nor do we take into effect the revisions, what they call the glosses or the redactions that carried on over time and kind of shaped the various books into this vast compendium that we have now called the Bible. I mean, I can think of two occasions when the Bible was largely, I won't say revised so much as glossed and shaped by particular circumstances, and that's just, within my own thinking, that the first one is after the Babylonian captivity. The Old Testament, it looks like it was shaped largely via the filter of the Babylonian captivity and put together by people like Nehemiah and Ezra. And they have their books in the Old Testament that are extant today, and we can read them. We can read those records of the way that the scroll was discovered. The scroll of the law was discovered in the wall of the temple that had been destroyed by the Babylonians those many years before. The Jews were taken away into captivity, and then they were released and they were allowed to return to their homeland, and they began to rebuild. They rebuilt the walls of the city of Jerusalem, and then they turned their attention to the temple, and that was when it was said this scroll was discovered, and they read it, and the people went into great lamentations and beat their breasts and said, "My goodness, we didn't know half the stuff in this law." Well, it looks as though in that time, the restoration of the walls of the city and the walls of the temple also were accompanied by a restoration and a gathering together of the old documents that make up the Torah, the Tanakh, as we now have it, the books of Moses, the 5 books that begin the Old Testament. And that was a seminal moment when the Old Testament, as we know it, came together in a form that we might recognize today in our modern Bibles. And the other point, when the New Testament was germinated, as it were, as a single entity, was those councils, those church councils around about the 4th century AD, when people started to debate about what should be regarded as sacred books and what should be cast aside, and then the list was formulated of the books that were to be approved, to be put into the New Testament. So these are just two of the kind of seminal points when this volume of ours came together in any meaningful way, in any identifiable way, i.e. in saying these books are included and these books aren't, for whatever reason they were. The Old Testament collection known as the Apocrypha and they're not to be found in many of the versions of the Bibles that we use today, although they're available. And Roman Catholics very often include them very firmly in their own publications of the Bible. So there we are. We got this sort of quick background of the way the Bible came together. So why on earth pay any attention to this collection of documents, ancient documents, from a world that's 1 million miles and a couple of thousand, maybe even 3,000-4,000 years away from our own? And that's a very good question. Why on earth bother with it at all? I mean, why have I bothered reading it all these years and trying to figure out its significance and what it means today? I hear a lot of people ask that question. It's a very good one. And I can only answer it in my own way, really. There's a couple of books I want to show you that may kind of help the argument along. One is this one. Okay. It is called Historical Israel, Biblical Israel. Now, this is an interesting book. I found it rivetingly interesting because it put the framework of the Old Testament into a really good perspective. There is an agenda to our own early book by the Venerable Bede, for instance, the ecclesiastical history of the English-speaking peoples. Now, anybody who bothers to study these things will tell you that Bede, the Venerable Bede, wrote this book with a particular agenda. Now, he was a staunch upholder of a relatively recently formed church in the British Isles. It was still being threatened by, Viking raids and other sort of groups that might have been there way before St. Augustine hit these shores, like the Celtic Church, for instance. And he wanted to kind of establish a viewpoint that put his church front and centre in the story of these British Isles. So that's the way he wrote the book, and you have to read the book in that light, really, in order to kind of to weed out some of his more obvious prejudices and understand where he was coming from. And this book, Historical Israel, Biblical Israel, does that for me. It puts the way that the history is written in the Old Testament, the 1 and 2 Kings, the 1 and 2 Chronicles, the 1 and 2 Samuel, all these kind of books that are almost like the official records of the state of Israel and later on the state of Judah as well, that are written to back up the priestly angle. That it's like the Venerable Bede saying, well, these wretched Anglo-Saxons, they forgot about God, and this is why God abandoned them to the barbarians that came in after the Romans left. Sorry, not the Anglo-Saxons, the Celtic people, of course. And serve them jolly well right too. And the Old Testament is full of this perspective of, well, King Rehoboam or King Ahab, he did wrong in the sight of the Lord. He neglected the sacrifices and he didn't read the holy books and he caused the people to run after other gods. This is the perspective. This is not a literal history, but a highly symbolic and a highly angled history of a particular small kingdom in the Middle East. So you have to bear that in mind when you're reading these kinds of things. So people, I do too, people like to quote from the Old Testament. They pick various verses that seem very significant to them, but you have to think of the context where these ideas came from. The way these books were written were to uphold a particular viewpoint and reinforce a picture of the ideal state that was supposed to accrue from following this particular God with these particular laws in place. So that's one book. It as I say, it's a bit show and tell. The other book that gave me a great insight into how to view the Bible is this one. The previous book was by Mary E. Mills. This one is by Karen Armstrong. You may well have heard of Karen Armstrong. She's written a lot of really quite astonishing books about not just Christianity, but all sorts of other faiths as well. And she writes with great insight. And you can see that she's really dug into the background of, in this particular case, myth. Now, I don't, this is why I'm showing you the book. I don't want you to misunderstand the use of the word myth. Myth is a word that in modern English is used to dismiss many ideas as rubbish, as figments of people's fevered imaginations, and not worth the time to even look into or analyse in any depth. But this is the book, A Short History of Myth by Karen Armstrong. And she explains in this book the place of, well, let's call it storytelling, or telling a story with a particular slant on it to illustrate something. And she makes the point in this book that there are a lot of stories being told in the Bible which illustrate some deeper truth about the human condition. And I think this is very important. Very often we find that there are things that we can barely express, that are buried deep in our minds, and we struggle with, don't we? The human mind is an incredibly complex and multi-layered organism, and some of the things that come out of it, you can barely put into any kind of words. And her point is, Karen Armstrong's point is, that what's happening with the Bible is that these stories are kind of illustrations of like psychodramas, that when you dig into them and when you absorb them, they become a means, a vehicle of hanging on to things that are barely recognized, that sort of arise as smoke and get blown away before you can grab hold of them, because they arise from this immense and incredible thing that we have inside our heads, the human mind, the brain. So I kind of like those two books in particular because of the insight they give into the possible usefulness of the Bible. Now, which Bible? Well, there are dozens of different versions these days, and it's a job to know. I've got a selection here. That here is a Bible. It's the New Scofield Reference Edition. Well, it's not very new now, of course, and it's got references down the margins and notes underneath. You can probably see it's a serious book. It's not a book you can easily just pick up and leaf through, because there are so many kind of webs that are knitted throughout the whole of this particular volume with cross references and notes that it would take you a lifetime to follow up. Here's another version. The New Revised Standard Version. It's the Anglicized edition. The reason it says that is because it's not the American edition, which is pitched and phrased slightly differently, as you would sort of expect, really. So that's the New Revised Standard Version. Is there such a thing as a standard version of the Bible? Lots of different people use lots of different versions. Here's an interesting one. I quite like this one. You may not have come across this. It's actually the Catholic edition of something called the Poverty and Justice Bible. How about that? That's quite interesting, isn't it? The Poverty and Justice Bible. And it gives a particular perspective on the content of both the Old and the New Testaments. You can turn to virtually any page and find these highlighted sections and they are to do with justice and how to treat the poor and deal with poverty. It's a very useful book because you can flick through any part of it and you'll find large sections of the Bible which you may have thought were about one particular thing are actually quite a lot about poverty and justice. Here's another one that I've used quite a lot myself, the New American Standard Bible. It's thought to be a good translation, a very good translation from the old, the standard Greek text. So yes, I've used this quite a lot myself, and there are places where I've marked it as being significant for me, and also it's a red letter Bible. Red letter Bibles are ones where the words of Christ are always printed in red, so they kind of stand out from the main body of the text. And here's one that a lot of people now use, the NIV. You notice that the word new occurs in quite a lot of these versions, and this is no exception. The New International Version. This is a study Bible. It's a bit like that first one I showed you, the Scofield Bible, Scofield Reference Bible, in that it's got lots and lots and lots and lots of cross-references and notes. It's absolutely full of them. It can be quite laborious getting through this, but I use it for a particular purpose when I need to, rather than just something to leaf through. So there are all these different versions of the Bible in modern English, which is very helpful. It's good to move on from the King James Version because some of it was actually mistranslated for a start. They didn't have the many documents, Greek documents, that are the background to our modern English Bible in the 17th century. So some of it was actually slightly mistranslated. It's a matter of discussion whether any of those mistranslations were significant or not. Possibly some were and others weren't. So to have the Bible in modern language that people can start to understand or read rather more fluently without falling over the these and thous and whatnot is kind of useful. There is one other thing I want to say about the Bible, and this is something I've come up entirely on my own, and I haven't come across it in any of my reading at all. I recall what Paul says, the Apostle Paul, who wrote a large section of what we now call the New Testament. His letters run like a great big thread through the New Testament, and they were some of the earliest documents to be written. You notice that he says things about becoming mature and growing up and not being children anymore, in understanding, be adults, I like to say in modern parlance. I mean, in King James it says in understanding be men. In modern parlance, in understanding be adults. He's constantly writing to the churches he set up around Asia Minor and in Greece, etc., telling them to basically grow up, which is, well, it's an interesting message, isn't it? Grow up. What does he mean by that? Well, I've kind of reflected that back down through the Old Testament, because it's mostly what the early church had anyway. At the time that Paul was writing, the New Testament didn't exist at all. So all they had to read was the Old Testament. So if you reflect this idea back down through the Old Testament, I've come up with this thought, and that is, you could view the thread that unifies the Bible as a kind of growing up through the stages of human development. When you're a baby, you need to be picked up, you need to be coddled, you need to be fed, you need to be changed. Everything is done for you. Your mother regulates when you sleep and when you eat and when you have your bath. And she is very interested in the first tooth, the first word, the first step on your little feet, staggering round the furniture. And this is like early parts of the Old Testament. They're all about beginnings, aren't they? In the beginning, the Bible and the whole Old Testament kicks off with this sentence, this resounding sentence, in the beginning. Well, in the beginning, what? That's a good question. In the beginning, what beginning was that? It can't have been the beginning of the world, can it? Because modern science and the theory of evolution has blown that completely out of the water. It is untenable to keep thinking that the first day of creation was in 5004 BC. It doesn't work. It's not possible to keep believing that. It's not rational. So what is it the beginning of? And I would say it's something like the beginning of consciousness. And that's a difficult thing to define, because how do you find out when the human race became conscious? When the stories that individuals told themselves began to be pulled together and made more coherent, and maybe were written down for the first time. When did this kind of human shared consciousness come about, where we became more like ourselves, as we know ourselves now, the organism that we call the modern human? This is kind of where it starts for me. And then when we grow up, when we start walking around on our legs, and when we start interacting with our larger family, our mums and dads are very keen that we sort of behave ourselves. They make rules about the way we should behave. When we sit at the table and we're able to hold a spoon in our hand for ourselves for the first time, they're quite keen that we don't make a terrible mess at the table, that we get enough food actually in our mouths to benefit from it. And so the rules then start to elaborate. When we go to school, we must get up at a certain time, we dress in a certain way, we have to behave ourselves in class. And if we're taken to church, we certainly know that there's a certain way to behave in church as well, or at least that when I was a lad, I was certainly given quite strict rules about how to behave in church and various other places too. So the rules became very important. The older we grew up, through our first decade, was all about this kind of development and this understanding of our place in society and our families and how to behave. The rules were very important, the same as they are in the Bible, the Ten Commandments, the book of Leviticus and the book of Deuteronomy, and all these very serious laws about how to behave and how not to behave, what to do and when to do it. And then it develops on from there that, the teenage years are rather stormy for some people, aren't they? They can be a problem simply from the point of view of our growing sense of our own identity, our own being, our own self. So that there are parts of the Bible that are more, they're more fuzzy, as it were. They launch into pictures and concepts that are not very fixed. I remember when I started to learn about electronics, I was taught about current flow in a conductor, in a piece of wire. Current flow is from the negative terminal to the positive terminal. And then as I learnt a bit more, I discovered that I had to think in a completely different way about electron flow. Electron flow actually goes the other way, from the positive terminal to the negative terminal. And it was a bit hard to take on board. I mean, I'm not exactly a genius at electronics by any means, but that switch in the way you think about how things work in a conductor, in electricity, showed me that there was something under the surface that maybe I hadn't grasped at first, that the picture gets reversed, it gets more complicated. And I think that this is the same with the human condition. With some people, adolescence is a troubled time, because they find that maybe the rules they learnt as a child are not standing them in good stead right now in this particularly turbulent time of their lives. And so it goes on until Paul says, you know what, the law was my schoolmaster to bring me to Christ, which is quite a good way of expressing this kind of development and this movement from a diet of milk to a diet of meat, he says. Move on from milk to meat. Grow up, develop your digestion, get a bit tougher, get a bit stronger, get a bit more resilient, become a stronger kind of human being until you arrive at a place where you don't struggle with the rules anymore. You don't have that same struggle. You're not constantly kicking against things that you regard as unfair or onerous. And then you have to grow up. You have to have your own mind about things. And that is a crucial moment. I mean, there are many other things in the Bible that it's really good to think about and point out, but that this is my thesis, as it were, to kind of try and get a grip on what the Bible's about and why we should bother with it today. There are hidden depths in the Bible which could do with digging. And digging is always a good thing. It stretches the mind. At the point where I start to admit that I don't know, that's a great place to be when it comes to thinking about the meanings of some of the more obtuse things in the Bible. So I'll leave you with that thought, and I'll go and stack my books back on my shelf. And until next time, keep safe.